So I wanted to put this slide up first. Defining your own success or failure, you are. Agile Yoda is often my guide whenever I'm thinking about things with regards to Agile. Most of the principles that he taught young Skywalker could probably be attributed right back to the manifesto. Let me turn this on. There we go. There we go. So this is Lean Accessibility, building inclusive design into your Agile workflow. I mentioned this last night to some friends. Normally, I give this as an 8-hour workshop for different people on a team, but we are going to compress it into a single hour. As such, I think it's important. My name is Elle Waters, in case you need to know that. And you can find me on Twitter at Nethermind. And I love email. I answer email, l@simplyaccessible.com, the company that I work for. We're a globally distributed team, so we have team members in the United States, in Canada, in the UK, Eastern Europe, Australia, Perth, Australia, and the Philippines. There was a period of time where we all had this vision of how beautiful and lovely the idea of waterfall development. And we saw it as we have all of this massive information. At the end of that, there's going to be this rainbow that will be this perfect project that we launch on time, on budget, meeting all of the stakeholders' expectations. This is the reality, the stark, cold reality often that waterfall brings to developers, which is that it feels like of a massive amount of requirements piling up onto you, and you're never on time, never on budget, and always chasing after that dream. A lot of people look at accessibility and they think of it as sort of the antithesis of what you would experience with Agile, but one of the things that I hope to be able to share with you is that accessibility and Agile go together like peanut butter and jelly, that they are fantastic partners in helping you succeed in both of those goals. So I am married to an Agile coach, and we have a Kanban board at our house. We used it to put our son into college, and so I would be remiss if I didn't abide by the time frame. So I'm going to try really hard to stay in line with this. It's going to be really difficult for me to do, but I put an alarm on my phone, so you'll hear it beeping, which means out of time, move on, because I want to respect your time, and I also want to be able to abide by some of these principles, which is to time box what we're doing. So we'll talk about what accessibility is, just a brief overview, and why consider accessibility, and then how to do accessibility in a lean and agile way. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for a Q&A and discussion. I would love to talk to anybody afterwards as well about this, and I'll buy you a drink tonight if you're going to any of the After Dark events. So, Sprint 1, what is accessibility? This is what Wikipedia says. Web accessibility refers to the inclusive practice of removing barriers that prevent interaction with or access to websites by people with disabilities. It's pretty straightforward. When sites are correctly designed, developed, and edited, all users have equal access to information and functionality. That's kind of a mouthful, though. So at Simply Accessible, we basically say for every person, for every device. Or, to put it simply, making things work for everyone, regardless of their abilities. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is a set of international standards, creates this really handy acronym called POUR, which stands for Perceivable, Operable, Understandable, and Robust. So all of accessibility kind of falls under these 4 principles. If you're thinking about the word perceivable, basically an example of that would be providing text equivalents and alternatives for content. So make me aware that that content actually exists. I don't have time to share with you this video, but I'll have it on the slides. It's definitely something you should take a look at. It's a wonderful video about the importance of captions and about the perception that somebody needs as their primary form of content being captions as compared to audio on multimedia. The second is operable. A good example, once I know something is there, allow me to be able to use that thing, whether it's a control, an interaction, make functionality available, and typically it's to keyboard and assistive technologies. Because most of the time you don't have difficulty making something available to a mouse user. Where we run into challenges is making something available to a keyboard user or somebody who uses assistive technology. This is a good example of things that we can never predict as web designers, of how people might be interacting with a website that we've created. This is a curved keyboard for someone who uses a stylus, and it's curved because that way he doesn't have to reach quite as far with that stylus in order to be able to tap out the letters on the keyboard. This is another example. This is a refreshable braille device. Often it's used in conjunction with a screen reader. And the interesting thing about this is not only is it a really cool piece of technology, but it comes out in a linear format. So that changes how somebody consumes your content because they're getting everything in 80 characters at a time. Understandable. One example, of course, would be make content readable, intuitive, and predictable. This is a version of our website at Simply Accessible, and we have this little bookmarklet that we use to demonstrate what it might feel like to have a learning disability, like dyslexia, where oftentimes you'll be transposing letters on the page as you're reading. So let's take a look at this. You can kind of make out what it is. We're building and I think probably because of the context, you'd be able to know that means digital world for everyone. And as you go down, some words are very easy, learn how, and then probably to navigate. And if you go through all of that, you can decode all of that. That's something you could probably do. But it takes you longer to decode than it does to just read. And this is not an exact replica of what it's like to have dyslexia, but it gives the same feeling of frustration and slower reading of content and the need to be able to decipher exactly what the word is that really communicates that same kind of anxiety that oftentimes people experience. And then finally, the last principle is robust. Maximize compatibility with current and future user tools is the easiest way to explain it. So make something as backwards compatible as you can, but also make it as future-proof as possible. The reason for that being that assistive technologies rely on a common language, in this case W3C valid code, in order to be able to interpret a website to be able to use it. And so if we're looking at this, we're really thinking about the idea of creating semantic, structured code that is not device-dependent. This is a good example. This is OpenSignal back in 2015, so this has changed. But this is a graphic displaying all the different possible screen resolutions for Android devices and their market share. So this kind of gives you that understanding. If you're a big fan of responsive web design and you understand the value of making something pretty independent, then it's something that you'll be able to keep in mind. All right, so I'm almost out of time, and I'm nowhere near the end. This is terrible. What different types of disabilities do we need to think about? Most people think about blindness or mobility as the first things that come to mind. They also think about deafness, and sometimes they think about people who have cognitive disabilities like autism or they're aging into dementia. The truth is somewhere much, much, much deeper, much greater. There's so many different types and layers of disabilities that it's impossible to start thinking about designing and developing just for specific disabilities. How many people have disabilities? There's often a sort of an awkward question that we get in the work that we do that this is really just a small group of people. This is, making something accessible for those small and marginalized user groups that may not even use your website. The truth is, 1 in 7 people in the world have a disability. According to the World Health Organization and Google.com accessibility, this is a really important statistic. That's effectively 1 billion people in the world, or 15%. So to put it in developer terms, 15% of the world's population versus 5.2% of internet users, or IE users. And yet, we think about Internet Explorer as a browser that we need to support all the time. So the Department for Work and Pensions discussed something called the Purple Pound here in the UK. Households with a disabled person have a combined income of £212 billion after housing costs. So that's a pretty impactful dollar or pound or euro, depending on where it is that you live. There's a statistic very similar to this. And many people have more than one disability. So everyone lives on a continuum with their own abilities and challenges. Susanna Gonzalez put this in Smashing Magazine several years ago, and it was called Designing for the Extremes. And the idea is that if you design for the extremes, you meet the needs of the many. And so somewhere along this is where most people find themselves in that bell curve. Accessibility is not binary, all or nothing, or black and white, and we have every shade of gray in between. So how you view this point will frame up your ideas about accessibility and what you do both today and going forward. All right, so Sprint 1 Retro, definitely over time. I hope that was a general introduction to accessibility and understanding sort of the overarching sort of holistic nature about the idea that this is really about people more than it is just about technology, or it's about the idea of making something usable more than it is about making something compliant. So let's talk a little bit about why consider accessibility. As an Agile practitioner, it's important for me to think about what the value is. It's more than just something that is the right thing to do. We live in a world that's a business-driven world, so we need to consider what value means. So this is a overly cliche concept in a game called Family Feud. Some of you guys may have seen this television show. I'm kind of surprised it's still on television. But the idea is basically we surveyed several user experience and developers and asked them, why don't you include accessibility in the work that you do? So the survey says the number one answer, accessibility is intimidating. Yes, it is. This picture is not unlike what my home office looked like the first year that I was trying to understand everything there was to know about accessibility. There's a mountain of information out there. There's no real clear way to know how to get started. If you look online, you see all of these different techniques for testing, for CSS, for client-side scripting, for plain text, for ARIA, for Flash even, Silverlight, PDF, etc. What do we call this in the accessibility industry? A good start, right? Because once you've learned these things, it's given you what? A foundation to be able to go from there. You don't easily know how to put that into practice in what you do every day. And then there's all these devices, and it can be very intimidating because not only are you thinking about the work that you do and the techniques you need to learn, but then there's all these other devices that people with disabilities may be bringing to your website or your application. And it's kind of hard to know exactly what they will be bringing and what you need to account for. Sometimes they look like a Casio keyboard. This is what I thought it was. I honestly thought it was a keyboard when I first saw it. And then there's even the most popular screen reader out there has a menacing, terrifying name, JAWS. So absolutely, accessibility is intimidating. Survey says, number 2 answer, accessibility is hard. Yes. But accessibility is hard because good design is hard. Apple, who I consider one of the pioneers of design, is quoted as, "We believe that technology should be accessible to everyone. The most powerful technology in the world is technology that everyone, including people with disabilities, can use. We don't design products for some people or even most people. We design them for every single person." So when you strive for good design, you're also usually striving for inclusive design before you even may realize it. And when you're striving for accessibility, you're actually raising the bar in your own craft, whether it be design or development or being a product owner. You're changing the bar and the level of excellence to include everyone. And third and final answer that we got from this survey, accessibility is not my job. Really? So the real question is, why are we doing this? If it's not your job to build something for users, why are you in this business? So we decided that we would go back to the drawing board and start looking at what the value is. So here's Agile principles to the rescue. Why consider accessibility at all? So a definition of value and ways to measure it, and then we can talk about the value of lean accessibility and the cost of delay and what accessibility does for Agile. So according to Christian Verwiges, founder of Agilistic, he put out several different definitions for value in an Agile world. There's commercial value, there's market value, there's efficiency value, customer value, and future value. So if you were to put lean accessibility into these definitions, for a commercial value, it increases the usability and speeds up purchase paths, without a doubt, proven, analytically verifiable. From a market value perspective, it increases potential new customers. Absolutely, you're talking about 15% of the population. Efficiency value, it increases organizational efficiency and decreases operational costs. Absolutely. Accessibility mandates clean semantic designs and code and a standardized way to approach something. And because it requires that, it makes you better at those operational processes. Customer value, it increases customer loyalty. People with disabilities have an inordinate amount of brand loyalty. Once they find that a website or a mobile application works for them, they will be always going to that website in that mobile application because you've made it that much easier for that person to be able to conduct a transaction, make a purchase, accomplish a task. Future value, it future-proofs the work to provide more value later on. You don't have to worry about the next device that may be coming out by the next major manufacturer. Maybe there's another mobile operating system that's coming out in a year. You don't have to worry about that because of the fact that you've built things solidly with a strong foundation and it's valid, so it's future-proofed and to be able to handle any kind of device resolution as well. So things to consider when you're back at your job. Everything that you do to make things work for someone that is blind or deaf actually helps with findability and SEO. And everything that you do to make things work for someone with low vision or mobility challenges actually helps with mobile users' interactions. These user personas are very similar to one another. And everything you do to make things better for someone with cognitive difficulties, making things easier, making things predictable and consistent, that helps everyone. The cost of delay. So this is a concept about the idea that the longer time you take, the less value there is in what you deliver. And it's an important Agile concept. It's part of the idea about delivering and release when ready and delivering early and often. With regards to accessibility, we worked with a major airline client, and they delayed the project by 2 months, and because of that, they didn't have time to be able to incorporate accessibility into the design phase, and that was in January. We didn't get started until March or April. The idea was a planned release in June. And because they had to go back and do all this rework again and again and again, they're now 6 months overdue, and 6 months further into project costs, and they're launching hopefully next week. And so there's a real measurable lack of value, decreasing value, the longer that you delay with a project. On the flip side of that, when we incorporate accessibility early into that process, we're building components that include accessibility, things sail past any kind of user testing. And as a result of that, any kind of timeline for maybe traditional UAT gets completely shrunk as a result. The power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. So if you need a final word on the matter, probably Sir Tim Berners-Lee is the right person to ask. And ultimately, accessibility makes Agile better because it focuses on users, it focuses on testing, it focuses on the idea of continuous improvement. All right, so let's see how we're doing. Yes, gain time back. So the next piece is really the part that I wanted to focus on more because this is the kind of thing that's really about the how-to. So how do I do lean accessibility? And the best way to approach this, I think, is by looking at individual roles. So how many of you guys are developers? It's going to be a guess that there would be the majority of you. Yeah. How many of you guys do any kind of UX or design in the work that you do? A couple, yeah, like a little bit, yeah. And there's maybe a couple of you guys, maybe you write stories. I don't know, it depends on how your team is organized. Sometimes it doesn't take just the product owner to write stories. So let's look at this. Guiding principles, being agile-minded is much more important than any kind of particular Agile methodology. Experimentation, continuous learning, and improvements that create a better online experience for users. That's what I would call being Agile-minded. So really, lean accessibility is the exact same thing. Experimentation and continuous learning and improvements that create a better online experience for all users, right? So this is not a fix-all. So no magic will occur in this talk or this session. However, you do have permission to fail. And so often people look at accessibility as that thing that they're sort of terrified of making a mistake on. But one thing we know from what Agile has taught us is that if you fail and you're considering your users as the end customer and you're always committed to improving, you will always benefit from that failure. So fail. You have permission to make mistakes with accessibility. And I may get hauled off by the accessibility police, but it's worth telling you guys that so that you know that you're able to experiment and find things that improve the user experience. So lean accessibility by role. We'll go through this somewhat quickly, and then we can talk a little more about specifics if there's questions that you have as developers. So for product owners, product owner guidelines for inclusive design, there are only 2 kinds of stories that you need to write, and 3 kinds of requirements that you need to define, and no sleepless nights that you should have in this. So stories are, by definition, at their purest form, the result of a shared understanding of the need, the solution, and the value for the user. So what they are not is a newspaper delivery, drive-by messages, secret clues left for a team to interpret. Oftentimes, stories are written as the only form of communication between a product owner or business stakeholder and the team. And that's not really what stories are meant to be, right? Stories are meant to be something that we all understand what's happening and what the need is and the requirements. And this is just a document that reflects that. So stories that are specifically about accessibility are about the need being accessibility, the solution being accessibility, and the value being accessibility. Here's an example of a story that's specifically to fix a problem. So, remediation story. There's a problem on our homepage with the embedded Twitter feed. It's making keyboard users get stuck in the iframe without the ability to do other things on our website. So that's what we call a keyboard trap, where you can tab into like an iframe experience, but you can't get out of it. So the need is about accessibility. The solution is to be able to fix that particular keyboard accessibility issue. And the value is accessibility, but also it benefits anybody who's using just a keyboard. Another example of a story would be that accessibility is built in, and so it's really part of the solution and the value. So another example of this is maybe a new feature. You want to put a Twitter feed on your website. I want a Twitter feed on our homepage that allows our users to read all the latest tweets that we post in real time, so they'll buy more cool stuff from us. So that need is really about an embedded Twitter feed that's a feature that you want to be able to introduce. The solution is whatever it is that you've decided how you want this to work, plus accessibility. And the value is all the stuff that you assume that you're going to get: deeper engagement, people are going to interact more, maybe it'll increase your purchasing power, plus accessibility. And here are the 3 requirement types for anything having to do with building out accessibility into an agile process. There's one stuff everyone should already know how to do, duh, and so I'm using a teenager rolling her eyes. Timeless best practices, and then things that are kind of snowflakes. So let's take a look at that. Let's say that the story that you want to be able to develop and design and develop is about a modal dialogue. So here's a screenshot, maybe you get a mock-up of what it is. And if you're looking at that, here's an example of accessibility requirements for that modal dialogue. That zip code field, we'll look at the zip code, that zip code field should have a label. Well, that's kind of like telling a developer to actually turn on their computer in a lot of ways, right? Because that's something that you should know to do. If it's a form element, it needs a label, and not just some orphan thing that looks like a label, but actually the for an ID attribute, right, linked programmatically. That's something that you shouldn't really have to explain, because it's just about doing things in a valid and well-structured way. The second requirement would be what we would call timeless best practices. So using the escape key should close this modal dialogue. That's something that is the case regardless. It's always going to be an accessibility requirement. It's never going to change in that sense. So it's the kind of thing that may not need to be in the story. It may be something that you just keep in sort of a best practices wiki. And then the last piece is really the stuff to focus on as a product owner. When you close the dialogue, the focus should go back to, and it's very specific to that particular design or development project. So when we're looking at this, you have role-based job skills, and that's really about people knowing how to do their own craft, right? If you're a developer, you should know how to be able to use HTML elements in the way they were designed to be used. Then there's sort of a knowledge wiki, and that's timeless things that will always be true as far as accessibility requirements about different things, having to do with forms, having to do with modals, having to do with navigation elements. And then there may be unique story requirements, and that's what you put into the story, and that's basically any specific detailed thing about that particular feature, like where the focus path should take a user after they've closed it. So UX and design leads, for those of you guys who do some UX, 5 things to know about inclusive design, really, that will carry you very far. The first, obvious wins. Call it what it is. The second, make it simple, make it easy. The third, make it consistent, make it predictable. The fourth, change your perspective and assume nothing. And the last, go see, or the Japanese word, gemba. So the first one, obvious wins, the Hamburger Menu. Several years ago, I think it was Facebook who decided this would be an awesome idea to roll out a new design idea, and they put together stacked lines, and they published that, and they thought, well, maybe it would be really intuitive, that people would understand that behind those stacked lines, or hamburger or pancake, is actually a menu. But there's an extensive amount of usability research that's been done to show that, unlike ourselves, who are web professionals, this is not obvious to people. And there's a lot of people who still to this day don't understand what that icon is supposed to be. And they found, actually, that the thing that made this most understandable to people is to put the word menu. And so looking at that, recognizing that having the word menu alongside of a hamburger menu is making it really obvious, right? Making it very clear and easy to understand. Another example, this is on our website, examples.simplyaccessible.com. And we put a lot of different things. Sometimes we put things that we're testing and we're making purposefully inaccessible. But this is an example of how we recommend people to treat forms and validation and error messaging. So some of these things are built specifically because of doing some usability research and recognizing that if you have multiple errors on a page, you want to group them all together at the top of the page. And in doing that, you want to be able to provide a couple of different ways, both with color, but also with iconography, that there's errors on that page. Another thing we did too was we actually listed how many items require someone's attention, so that people don't have to guess how many is in that list. If you're listening to this with a screen reader, you'll be able to actually know, I have 3 things that I need to be able to fix on this page. And then one of the other features that we did in order to help people with mobility challenges is we made the actual list item within the error messaging bucket a hyperlink that will take the user directly to the field that needs to be corrected. And we found that that made things a lot simpler and a lot easier for someone to be able to recover from their errors and from their mistakes. We've recommended this particular pattern to a lot of clients and a lot of teams, and it's succeeded across different industries as far as usability research. Make it consistent. So we're big believers in pattern libraries, regardless of how far into that work that you are. And so people should be able to know that when they're interacting with something, that it's going to have the same action each time that they interact with it. So your navigation elements, your error messaging, all of that should be incredibly consistent throughout the site. Instead of 5 different ways to handle error messaging, instead of 3 or 4 different navigation patterns or collapsing divs, you should be consistent with the way that you approach those things. And it makes it so much easier for your users. This is a screenshot of one of my coworkers, and what we like to teach people to do is to simulate the feeling of what it's like to have low vision. And so we have it, it's called the straw test. And you basically put your hand into like a straw, like you're holding a straw, and you close one eye and you look through your web page through that experience. And so the idea is to put yourself in the position of somebody else, and even though you maybe can't actually experience what it's like if you don't have that particular disability, it still allows you to be able to make different assumptions or no assumptions about the way that you're designing things. This is especially helpful when you're a designer and you're thinking about issues of proximity specifically. And then finally, always go see. You've heard me mention a couple of times that we do a lot of usability research and testing, because no amount of best practices or techniques will ever compare to actually testing with real people. And this is especially true with people with disabilities. Last year, one of the things that we found that was very surprising to us is when we were doing usability testing, our clients are now moving pretty much almost all the time into a responsive design. So we were doing some testing for one of our clients, and we found out of the 8 people who use screen readers, 3 of them didn't have a monitor. So they don't necessarily need a monitor. If somebody is blind, he or she is not necessarily going to need to hook up a monitor to their computer. And when we're doing this, it occurred to us that what's happening is the operating system, like Windows operating system, would be rendering a small version, like 150 pixels by 150 pixel browser size. And in doing that, it was throwing it into the mobile experience, even though somebody was on a desktop. So even though they were using a keyboard, and they're using a desktop screen reader, they were being delivered the mobile view. That was a pretty big surprise to us. So now when we do our own testing with our own testing team, we actually run through the paces of doing some unusual scenarios where we have split view, we may have a really long portrait view, we may have the bookmarks toolbar type things open, and we will be looking at the mobile view through desktop testing tools. Just because there is no way to know until you go and see what people might be using in order to be able to interact with your content. Yep, that was one of our examples. So usability testers, we've talked a little bit about that. A lot of times people create personas when they're doing usability testing, and they look at who their primary user is and who their secondary user is. So we've kind of mapped the idea of inclusive personas, not personas specifically of people with disabilities, but mapping some of those disability considerations to the personas that someone already has. So who is my primary user and who is my secondary user is something that a lot of different people within the design field should think about. If you're working in content strategy or information architecture, your primary user are neurally diverse users. So anyone who may be on the autism spectrum or they're aging into dementia. Your secondary user are non-native language speakers, so people who don't necessarily speak the language in which the site is built as a primary language. This really helps you understand creating a solid content structure. And you can conduct usability testing with paper prototypes and sketches, so you can do it way early in the design phase. For the visual designer, low vision users and colorblind users are the two primary personas to consider. And you can conduct usability testing with high fidelity mockups. For the interaction designer, people with mobility challenges and blind users. There's a whole lot of accessibility that is built in at the keyboard level. And you can conduct usability testing with HTML prototypes after you've done some internal QA. It's really important if you're going to do usability testing and you're pulling somebody in to do a test, whether remotely, which is what we typically recommend, or maybe in your office, that you don't make something that's an obvious barrier, something that means that they can't even complete the test. You want to do your own QA first before you do that. Developers, now we're here to the good part, right? Like science, web standards exist, whether you believe in them or not. So this is, by far, if you take away one thing as a developer for accessibility, if you are absolutely zealous about web standards, you will have gotten 60 to 70% of the way towards accessibility. Because, as I mentioned before, assistive technology relies on that standardized interaction between the technology and your languages, whether it be HTML, JavaScript, CSS, client-side stuff. And so if you make it look like a button and act like a button, don't make it a span or a div, make it a button. If you decide that you want to have a radio button, but you're going to make it a span below the scenes, then you have so much work to do in order for it to really interact as a button or radio button with assistive technology. So that is the number one thing by far. The second thing that we typically recommend, test-driven development. This is probably at this conference is something that you guys are like, yeah, okay, I do this all the time. Absolutely, we do this every day. This is actually still pretty uncommon in a lot of large organizations. It's difficult for them to embrace this, but this is the absolute best way as a developer for you to be able to ensure accessibility is baked into what you do, because you create the test, you run the test, you'll find out immediately when you commit something as to whether or not it failed or passed, right? And it teaches you. One of the things I love about developers is they're not afraid of making mistakes. Developers actually embrace that as a way to learn to improve. And so that's one reason why I think that they're tremendous agile champions. And they're fantastic at once they adopt accessibility into what they do, because they understand the concept of being able to do something and learn from it and improve as they go. Pattern all the things. This becomes an incredibly difficult adventure to make a bespoke, accessible dialogue every single time, right? But if you do this and put so much effort into a single really well-designed and created modal dialogue, that's all that you need to do from that point on. So pattern all the things, yes. What is the best assistive technology for developers to test with? This is a question we get a lot, and I'm happy to say that the tool that we recommend the most is free, and you all have it. The best assistive technology for developers to test with is your keyboard. There are other things. There are screen readers. There's Zoom technology. There's voice dictation software that allows someone who might have mobility impairments. There are all manner of kinds of automated test suites that you can run that will pick up some accessibility issues. But by far, the most important thing that you can do after having web standards-driven code is to be able to make sure that you have exemplary keyboard accessibility, that you understand how to be able to use arrows and tabs and enter and space, and that you're doing it according to the specification. This makes for a huge amount of accessibility for many user groups. One thing that we recommend if you are going to be doing some individual testing at your desktop is something called the Web Developer Toolbar or extension, depending on Firefox or Chrome. And while this isn't expressly an accessibility testing tool, as you see, it's got all these menus within there, and that especially for you guys who are really comfortable with source code, it's wonderful. Between this and having Firebug installed or something to be able to inspect the elements, it allows you to be able to take a look and really identify some of these pieces. We believe very strongly in test automation. However, it's not something that you should really build in until you really are willing to look at accessibility as a process. And the best thing to do is to think about integrating something into, say, if you have Selenium or Jenkins and you already have some kind of test automation, look to build accessibility into that workflow. Otherwise, you know, you're going to be buying some overpriced, very big tool that doesn't really fit with your processes. So this is an easy, straightforward way. These are the ways to be able to build in accessibility into what you do. If you're looking at enterprise-level test automation, think in terms of test suites that you can write. There's JavaScript tests that you can build into what you're already doing, and that helps you get that extra 25%. If you, say, commit things and have a nightly build, have accessibility tests run that way, and then you'll be able to get that kind of feedback that you're looking for. QA testers. So this is a question that I always pose to people. So why isn't this agile, where we have a wheel, 2 wheels and an axle, a convertible without a steering wheel, and then a convertible with a steering wheel? This is a participatory sport. I'm going to ask that question. Why is this not agile? What's that? 3 sad faces. Why are there 3 sad faces? Yes, you should be happy. Agile is happy. Exactly. That's it. The reason why they're sad is because they get no joy and they get no use out of this stuff until the very end, right? And that's sort of the antithesis of agile. Instead, if you look at agile, which, you know, we can tell it's agile because there's happy faces across all the way. So that's one thing we've definitely learned. But it's usable at each step, right? That's the whole concept of a minimum viable product, is the idea of something that's shippable immediately and usable. So I don't know if any of you guys have ever had that painful moment where you did a demo with a client where you only had code and only had back-end stuff, and it didn't go so well because you couldn't really demonstrate all the work that you had put into something, because it really wasn't a slice. It was really more about foundational layer. And while that makes sense from a development perspective, it doesn't really deliver something usable and create that bond and that trust with you and the business stakeholder. So likewise, with accessibility, with testing in particular, there is no point in looking at accessibility testing saying, well, we have to do all of it or none of it. Like, we can't possibly do all this accessibility testing, so we're out. We'll figure it out next year. Instead, what we recommend to client teams is to take it exactly the same way and iterate off of your testing. The most important things that I think we talked about earlier is keyboard and valid code. Keyboard accessibility and valid code are the foundational, most important things. We did a research study with all of our last 4 years of projects, and we found not only did 60 to 70% of the issues that we found originated with bad practices, like invalid code, using things, kind of shortcuts, that kind of stuff. But we also found that keyboard issues, while it's maybe only about 30% of the web content accessibility guidelines, it really addresses more than 50% of the most common user needs. And so it's the higher value item for more users. So keyboard accessibility and valid code. Then you come back to that after you've released that. Images, making sure that there's text equivalents for images. Color with color contrast and making sure color is not the only thing that's conveying some meaning. Then you iterate off of that, and you start looking at headings and forms. And honestly, each time that you're releasing something along this, it becomes exponentially more accessible. Then you're looking at text resize, being able to have a really flexible layout so that you're not breaking all of the content just because somebody has bumped up their text. Proximity, making sure that if you have a call to action here, that the button at the bottom is not what is related to it, right? Group-related items. And then everything else. And if you approach it this way, then you're basically making this really measurable improvement and providing huge value each time. So who benefits from lean accessibility testing? People with mobility issues who rely on the keyboard or other alternative input devices. People who rely on assistive technology for any reason. People who may turn off images or they need more contrast on web pages. And people who have difficulty using headings or forms because of cognitive, learning, language, or attention issues. This is the kind of amazing quality and value that you bring to all kinds of users when you're approaching this in an iterative way. All right, so where are we with our time? Yes. So a final word about scalability, and I think it's important, especially if you guys work at large organizations. One of my favorite quotes, Jeff Goethel, of course, a writer of Lean UX, he said, "Scale principles, not process." So as you're looking at how to be able to build accessibility into a lean process, as you're looking at how to be able to incorporate inclusive design into your agile workflow, think in terms of what the value is for your end users, and knowing that your end users, 15% of those users are people who may have a disability. So it's less about compliance and your process needing to scale, and it's much more about ensuring that your principles are intact and that it's a part of your culture. Because when it's a part of your culture, it becomes a much easier thing because it becomes a priority. So process gets you short-term gains, principles get you long-term change. So, questions? Shall we discuss? Do you have any questions specific to accessibility? Yes.
What is the accessibility issue that the majority of people deal with? Like, what's the one you deal with the most?
That's a really good question. I think that it really does boil down to keyboard accessibility and images. We typically, when we work with clients, we start with keyboard and image-related issues, and then we go ahead and tackle forms because we're trying to build a pattern library for them. And there's kind of this feeling like if they can get through an entire form, like say a multi-page form, they've pretty much addressed almost every accessibility on their site, issue on their site, because Accessibility is more of a challenge when it's a much more dynamic, interactive experience. So anytime a user is interacting with something, often it involves a form element. So between keyboard, accessibility, and images, those are the two probably most common. And then right after that, we typically go after forms because invariably, like, we're really surprised if we're doing a lot of testing and we find that somebody has built very accessible forms, because it's rare. Especially when you're doing these drag and drop kind of controls, there's not often a lot of accessibility built into that. That's a good question. Yeah? So you mean like return on investment for accessibility in particular? Yeah. It's difficult because oftentimes there's, if you're looking at something, people are redesigning their entire experience. They may be beefing up the search engine optimization. They may be looking at new technology stacks. So many times accessibility is sort of a partner to a lot of different initiatives. So it's difficult to parse out that specific return on investment. We do have an A/B test that's going, though, that is working on something where we've kind of injected, similar to a multivariate test where you put a different view layer. We've taken the same web pages and put accessible web pages in their stead without changing any of the design elements, because we're trying to measure that exact thing to be able to show a conversion increases or not. But it's hard to get that kind of information, and it's harder still to share it outside the organizations that we work with. I know that when I worked at a Fortune 100 healthcare company, we saw measurable improvements, but it's because of the fact that we approached accessibility from a usability perspective. And so we definitely increased conversion when we made things more keyboard accessible. We also, though, had an older audience because we were dealing with Medicare products. So you're always going to see sort of an overlap between older users and people with disabilities, because sometimes they're one and the same, but oftentimes people are aging into maybe some disability. So we definitely had the metrics to be able to prove that we had about a 30% increase in conversion when we improved keyboard accessibility and color contrast. Other organizations, though, it's always sort of a chasing after that metric. It's something that I desperately want to be able to find a way to anonymize and share for sure. You interested in a pilot? We could do something together. Right. Sure. Well, right. Right. Well, and I think that, one way is how strong are your analytics to begin with, and then being able to have a comparison over time, definitely. And if it is the only improvements that you're making, then it's relatively straightforward to be able to determine. If you have a pretty consistent sales cycle, for example, you're able to compare, then it's a straightforward kind of thing to do. There's ways to look at abandonment rates and whether or not those drop off and see whether they're related to keyboard accessibility issues. We've done that before as well. Any other questions? Thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate it.